At least face the wall, you filthy mechanic, my daughter-in-law shouted across a ballroom filled with nearly 300 wedding guests. The music stopped. Conversations died in mid-sentence. Every head turned toward me. Lisa, that's enough, my son Jake whispered. But he didn't step in front of me. He didn't stand beside me. He just stood there. No, Lisa snapped, pointing toward the hallway. Look at his hands. They're covered in grease stains. We spent $80,000 on this wedding. The least he can do is stay out of the photos. A few people laughed. Not many. Just enough. Just enough to make it hurt. I looked down at my hands. The same hands that had spent 52 years fixing engines. The same hands that paid for Jake's braces, his college tuition, his first car, and every baseball glove he ever owned. And in that moment, standing inside the grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel in Chicago, I felt smaller than I had ever felt in my 74 years on this earth. Before I tell you what happened next, if this story speaks to your heart, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, but only if this story truly resonates with you. And I'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave your city, your country, and your local time in the comments below. My name is Edward Harper. I'm 74 years old. I spent most of my life as a mechanic. And this was the day my own family nearly broke my heart without realizing they were destroying their future too. The lesson I learned that day changed everything. And if you stay with me until the end, I think it might change something for you as well. Now let me take you back to where it all began. 3 hours earlier, I had parked my old pickup truck behind the hotel loading area because valet attendants kept directing luxury vehicles to the main entrance. My truck was 23 years old. It rattled when it started. The paint had faded years ago, but I loved that truck. It had carried me through half my life. I walked into the hotel carrying a simple white envelope. Nothing fancy. No giant gift box. No ribbon. Just an envelope tucked inside my suit jacket. Dad, you made it, Jake said when he saw me. He hugged me quickly, looking over his shoulder as if worried someone might be watching. Wouldn't miss it, I told him. You nervous? Terrified, he laughed. For a moment, I saw the little boy who used to sit beside me in the garage asking 100 questions every hour. Then Lisa appeared. Her smile disappeared the moment she noticed my truck keys hanging from my belt. Ed, she said, the photographer is taking family portraits soon. Good, I replied. I'm looking forward to it. She hesitated. Actually, we're keeping the photos limited. Immediate family only. I blinked. I am immediate family. You know what I mean, she answered. Then she walked away before I could respond. The words stung, but I swallowed them. Throughout the afternoon, similar moments kept piling up. At the rehearsal luncheon, I was seated at a table near the back with distant coworkers. During introductions, Lisa thanked her parents, her college friends, her business mentors, and even her wedding planner. She never mentioned me. Not once. By evening, I started noticing something else. Whenever guests asked how Jake had managed to afford such a lavish wedding, Lisa quickly changed the subject. Whenever someone mentioned family support, she redirected the conversation. It was almost as if she wanted people to believe Jake, and she had built everything entirely on their own. Then came the moment in the ballroom. The shouting, the humiliation, the silence. After her outburst, I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't raise my voice. I simply reached into my jacket and touched the envelope. Lisa mistook my silence for weakness. See, she said loudly. He knows I'm right. I smiled. Not because I was happy, because suddenly I understood something important. Nobody in that room knew what was actually inside the envelope. Not Lisa, not Jake, not a single guest. And more importantly, nobody knew why that envelope existed in the first place. I slowly removed it from my pocket and stared at it for a few seconds. Jake's face turned pale. Dad, what are you doing? He asked. I looked at my son. Then I looked at Lisa. Then I carefully tore the envelope straight down the middle. The room went completely silent. But what nobody knew, not even Jake, was that the envelope wasn't the biggest secret I was carrying that night. Because 2 weeks earlier, I had discovered something in my late wife's safety deposit box, something she had hidden for nearly 20 years. And the moment I remembered it, I realized this wedding was about to become the beginning of a story none of them were prepared to hear. As I left the wedding hall and stepped out onto the quiet terrace overlooking Lake Michigan, the cold wind brushed against my face, carrying a strange mixture of relief and unease. I could still hear the faint murmur of guests inside, their laughter and whispers fading as I leaned against the railing. My mind drifted back to the summers the first spent in my father's garage in Joliet, Illinois, when I was barely 10 years old, scraping grease off old engines while my older brothers lounged on the porch, sipping soda and telling stories I could never join. "Edward, hand me that wrench." My father would bark, not looking at me, assuming I could not reach it, though I stretched on tiptoe and grabbed it for him. It was always the same. No praise, no acknowledgement, just the work and the expectation that I would silently comply. "Why do you always get the easy jobs?" I remember asking my brother Tom one day, trying to understand why he never had to sweep the floors or wipe the oil-stained benches. "Because Dad knows I am better at the engines," he said, smirking, but I saw the way he avoided the real challenge, how he shirked responsibility while I carried it for both of us. Those early years were filled with small injustices, favorite tools kept for him, my clothes stained and ignored, the extra chores assigned to me while they played baseball in the street. I remember the summer of my 12th birthday, when all I wanted was to take a trip to the city with my friends. My father had me reorganizing the tool cabinets instead. "It builds character," he muttered, though I could see the hint of pride in his eyes when the work was done right, yet he never acknowledged the effort out loud. And yet, in that garage, amidst the smell of oil and metal, I learned patience and observation, noticing small details, understanding the mechanics of engines, and, unknowingly, the mechanics of people around me. I could see favoritism, the subtle way my father allowed my brothers to slip past responsibility while I carried the weight, and I started learning to anticipate their actions, to move quietly but effectively. Those lessons would become the foundation of my character, though at the time I only felt the sting of unfairness. I remember once when my mother baked a batch of cookies, my brothers ran off to deliver them to friends while I stayed behind to clean the kitchen, wiping up flour from the linoleum and drying the mixing bowls. "You can eat them later," she said, handing me a single cookie, as if the labor justified the reward, though I had hoped for laughter and shared joy, not quiet solitude. That sense of being overlooked, of carrying burdens silently while others enjoyed recognition, planted a seed in me that I did not fully understand until many decades later. I walked along the terrace, running my fingers over the envelope still in my pocket, feeling the weight of not only the paper, but the years of quiet endurance, of watching and waiting, of understanding the dynamics of family and pride, of anticipation and patience learned from childhood. It was strange how those early experiences echoed in the grand ballroom tonight, in the way Lisa assumed she had the upper hand, how Jake faltered between loyalty and embarrassment. "Dad, are you going to be okay?" Jake called softly from the open doorway. I smiled faintly, the same calm I had cultivated in those long hours in the garage. "I have always been okay, son," I replied, the memory of young Edward scrubbing floors and lifting wrenches blending seamlessly with the man who had just quietly torn apart a misguided gesture in front of hundreds of people. And yet, beneath the calm, I felt a stirring, a sense that this evening was only the beginning of a reckoning, a chance for the truths long buried to surface. I looked back at the doors of the ballroom, the laughter fading, the chandeliers shimmering, and I knew that what had been hidden for decades, the stories, the misunderstandings, the unseen efforts, was about to find its place in the light, and that every small injustice from my past had prepared me for this moment, though none of them yet knew how significant it would become. The next morning, the sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors of my modest apartment in Chicago, cutting through the quiet that had settled after last night's chaos. I poured a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, listening to the faint hum of traffic outside and the occasional gull calling from the lake. Something had shifted inside me. I realized that for the first time in years, I did not feel the familiar weight of needing to prove myself to anyone. I could still see the expression on Lisa's face, a mixture of disbelief and anger, and I understood that my silence had unsettled her far more than any argument ever could. My phone buzzed on the table, and I saw a message from Carol, my sister-in-law. "Edward, can we talk? I think you should know what has been happening behind the scenes," it read. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the words sink in. Carol had always been perceptive, the one in the family who noticed the small injustices that others overlooked. I dialed her number, and we spoke quietly in the kitchen, our voices barely above the hum of the refrigerator. "Ed," she said, Lisa has been manipulating some of Jake's friends and business contacts, trying to make it seem like she arranged the wedding entirely on her own. She has been dismissing your contributions, even your advice on the repairs for the rental property you helped maintain. I nodded, the corners of my mouth curling into a small, controlled smile. I know, Carol. I have known for a long time. It is time they see the reality. Later that afternoon, I met with a few of Jake's colleagues at a small cafe near Wrigleyville. As I spoke with them, I maintained my calm demeanor, answering questions about the property and the family history without showing any irritation. "Edward, are you certain about this?" one of them asked, eyes wide. I nodded slowly. "I have records and documents that clarify everything. It is not about revenge. It is about honesty and fairness." The way they leaned in, listening carefully, gave me a sense of quiet authority I had not felt in years. At that moment, I realized something important. My voice carried weight, even when I spoke softly. I did not need to shout or demand attention. The truth itself was compelling enough. Later in the day, as I returned home, Jake called. "Dad, I need to talk. Can we meet tonight?" His tone was hesitant, uncertain, but the fact that he reached out on his own was a subtle victory. I agreed, choosing the small library in my apartment building where we would not be overheard. That evening, as we sat across from each other, Jake admitted, "Dad, I did not understand the full extent of everything you have done for us. I feel foolish." I reached across the table and placed a hand on his shoulder. "It is never too late to understand, Jake. That is all I want." Meanwhile, in the background, I could feel Lisa pacing, unaware that I had already begun securing allies within the family and among acquaintances who valued truth over pretense. Her confidence was beginning to waver, though she did not yet realize it. I did not react to her subtle jabs or the sharp remarks she whispered when she thought no one was listening. For once, I allowed her to fume while I maintained my composure, knowing that my restraint was more powerful than any argument. By the end of the night, as I walked back to my apartment overlooking the dark waters of Lake Michigan, I felt a quiet triumph. The smallest steps were turning into momentum. Connections that had once ignored me were listening. Eyes that had once dismissed me were beginning to see. And deep down, I knew that what was about to happen next, the unveiling of truths long concealed, would change the family dynamic in ways they could never anticipate. Something significant was on the horizon, and I felt the anticipation rise like the first hint of sunlight over the lake, promising revelations that would soon alter everything. The day after the wedding, I found myself sitting in my study, the envelope from the ceremony still resting on my desk, untouched but heavy with significance. I had intended to let the events settle, to observe and gather my thoughts, but what I discovered next made my chest tighten. A series of emails had been forwarded to me, messages from Jake's friends and some distant relatives, praising Lisa for orchestrating the perfect wedding and crediting her with every detail, every arrangement, as if she alone had orchestrated months of planning that I had quietly contributed to. My eyes narrowed as I read line after line. Lisa handled all the vendors. She even coordinated the seating charts, one email claimed. Without her, the ceremony would not have been nearly as elegant, wrote another. I felt a wave of disbelief, followed by a deeper, colder shock. It was not only the deception but the fact that everyone seemed to believe it, as though the truth about my involvement and support did not exist. Later, I met with Jake at a small park near our apartment, the wind rustling through the trees as we walked along the paved path. "Dad, have you seen these emails?" Jake asked, his voice tight, the hint of guilt masked by nervousness. I nodded slowly. "I have. It seems the story has taken a life of its own." He ran a hand through his hair, looking down at the ground. I did not realize how far she went. I should have spoken up, but I didn't want to create a scene. I stopped and looked him in the eyes. "Jake, sometimes silence can be as damaging as words. It allows lies to spread, and in this case, they have been accepted as truth." He swallowed hard, nodding. I never thought everyone would believe her. Not friends, not family, not even some of the vendors. That afternoon, I decided to confront the situation quietly. I arranged a meeting with two of the key vendors, a florist and the caterer, at a local cafe, under the pretense of thanking them for their work. As we sipped coffee, I inquired casually about the planning, about the coordination, and how tasks had been assigned. Both spoke warmly of Lisa, praising her organizational skills, unaware that I was listening for every misattribution. The deeper I listened, the more I realized the extent of the manipulation. Small lies, what seemed like polite exaggerations, had compounded into a narrative where I appeared absent, disengaged, and inconsequential. Even my son's closest friends had unknowingly perpetuated this version of events, repeating Lisa's words as if they were facts. The weight of betrayal settled on me, a quiet but persistent ache. I had anticipated challenges, perhaps small acts of neglect or underappreciation, but I had not expected such a meticulously constructed web of deception to be believed so widely. By the late afternoon, I returned home, exhausted, but a flicker of resolve had sparked within me. I knew that to correct the record, to restore fairness and recognition, I would need more than just words. I would need evidence, timing, and patience. As evening fell, the sun casting long shadows across my living room, I heard a familiar knock at the door. It was Carol, her face serious, carrying a folder of documents she had uncovered from various family accounts and planning records. "Edward," she said softly, "you need to see these. It is worse than I thought, but it explains everything." I took the folder, my hands steady despite the turmoil inside. As I began to sift through the pages, the full scope of Lisa's deception became horrifyingly clear. Forged signatures, manipulated schedules, even misrepresented payments to vendors, all woven together into a narrative that placed her at the center and cast me as a passive bystander. The realization hit me like a physical force, and I leaned back in my chair, a heavy silence settling over the room. Every interaction, every casual remark I had made during the wedding was now framed by someone else's story. The sense of injustice, the years of quiet work and support, had been rewritten. And in that moment, as I stared at the papers and felt the betrayal sink to my bones, I knew that the coming days would be pivotal. Something had to give. The carefully constructed image of control and elegance that Lisa had built was beginning to crack, and I could feel, with a mixture of dread and anticipation, that the entire web of lies was about to unravel completely. The following week felt longer than an entire year. Every morning I woke up hoping that someone would finally tell the truth, that someone would stand up and correct the story that had spread through the family, the wedding guests, and even people who barely knew us. Instead, the opposite happened. The false version of events continued growing like a weed nobody wanted to pull out. My phone filled with messages, but none of them brought clarity. One afternoon, I opened a group email that had been forwarded to nearly 40 relatives. Someone had written, "We should all appreciate the effort Lisa put into making everything happen." Another replied, "She carried the entire family through the wedding planning." Not one person mentioned the countless weekends I had spent repairing the lake property where guests stayed, arranging transportation, or quietly covering expenses nobody else wanted to handle. I stared at the screen for several minutes before closing the laptop. Later that day, Jake called. "Dad, I sent a message to some people," he said. "I tried explaining that you helped more than anyone realizes." "And?" I asked. A long silence followed. Nobody responded. I looked out the window toward Lake Michigan. Sometimes people do not reject the truth because it is false. They reject it because it is inconvenient. Jake sighed heavily. "I am sorry. I know you are." The next morning, Carol showed me several text messages she had received. One relative wrote, "Edward seems upset because he was not the center of attention." Another claimed I had exaggerated my contributions to gain sympathy. I read every word carefully. What shocked me was not the cruelty. It was how easily people accepted a story without ever asking questions. Carol shook her head. I tried correcting them. "What happened?" I asked. They stopped replying. Even written proof seemed useless. We sent copies of vendor invoices. We shared planning records. We provided emails showing who handled specific arrangements. None of it mattered. People believed what they had already decided to believe. A few days later, I received a handwritten note from an elderly cousin in Milwaukee. For a moment, I thought someone finally understood. I opened the envelope slowly. The letter began kindly enough, but halfway through it became another lecture. "Family harmony matters more than being right," it said. "Sometimes older people must learn to let younger generations take credit." I folded the paper carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. For 74 years, I had worked hard, paid my bills, kept my promises, and treated people fairly. Yet somehow honesty was now being mistaken for pride. One evening, Jake stopped by my apartment carrying a folder. His shoulders slumped the moment he entered. "More messages?" I asked. He nodded. "I reached out to 12 people, and 11 ignored me. One told me to stop creating drama." I leaned back in my chair. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, he asked, "How are you staying so calm?" I looked at him and smiled sadly. "Because this is not the first time I have watched people choose comfort over truth." He lowered his eyes. "I hate that I helped create this." "Then learn from it," I said softly. "That is all any of us can do." That night, after Jake left, I sat alone in the apartment. The city lights reflected across the dark water outside my window. My phone remained silent. No calls. No apologies. No honest conversations. The evidence existed. The facts existed. Yet every attempt to repair the damage had failed. The truth was sitting in plain sight, and nobody wanted to look at it. For the first time since the wedding, I felt completely alone. Not angry. Not defeated. Just isolated. As midnight approached, I opened the folder Carol had brought earlier and noticed one document I had somehow overlooked before. It contained a name I had not expected to see, and the moment I read it, I realized the deception went far deeper than anyone had imagined. I sat at my kitchen table long after midnight, staring at the name on that document. It was not a stranger. It was not a business partner. It was someone I had trusted for years. Someone who had smiled at family dinners, shaken my hand at holidays, and thanked me for favors I never expected to be repaid. The discovery did not make me angry. It made me tired. Deeply tired. There is a kind of exhaustion that comes from physical labor, and after 52 years of rebuilding engines, replacing transmissions, and working 12-hour shifts, I knew that feeling well. But this was different. This was the exhaustion of realizing that people you loved had been building a story about you while you were still sitting at the same table with them. The next morning, I drove north along the lakefront. Chicago was just beginning to wake up. Joggers moved along the trails. Coffee shops opened their doors. Life continued as if nothing had changed. I stopped near a quiet overlook and watched the water for almost an hour. My wife, Margaret, used to love that view. She had been gone for nearly 8 years, yet there were mornings when I still expected to hear her voice from the passenger seat. "You are thinking too much again, Ed," she would say with a smile. Back then, I would laugh and tell her she was probably right. Now there was only silence. I found myself speaking aloud anyway. "You would know what to do," I whispered. "You always did." The wind carried the words away. For the first time since the wedding, I allowed myself to admit something painful. I was lonely, not because I lived alone. I had learned to live with that after Margaret passed away. I was lonely because the people closest to me no longer seemed to know who I was. Later that afternoon, Jake called. "Dad, are you home?" he asked. "I am." 30 minutes later, he arrived carrying takeout containers from my favorite diner. We sat together in the kitchen. For a while, neither of us spoke. Finally, he looked up and said, "I keep replaying everything in my head." "So do I answered. "I should have protected you," he said quietly. "I should have corrected people sooner." I looked at my son and saw genuine regret. "Maybe," I said. "But this is bigger than one conversation or one mistake." He nodded slowly. "Then what is it?" I thought about that question for a long moment. It is about what happens when people stop seeing a person and start seeing a story instead. Jake lowered his eyes. Neither of us had an answer after that. When he left, the apartment felt even quieter than before. The phone stopped ringing. The emails slowed down. Even the criticism seemed to fade. It was as if everyone had moved on while I remained stuck in the aftermath. For several days, I barely left home. I sorted old photographs. I read letters Margaret had written decades earlier. I opened boxes that had not been touched in years. Somewhere during those quiet hours, something unexpected happened. I stopped focusing on what had been taken from me. Instead, I started noticing what still remained. My health, my memories, my integrity, my ability to choose what happened next. That realization did not erase the pain, but it changed its shape. One evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the city skyline, my phone buzzed with a message from Carol. "Edward, I found something else. You need to see this immediately." Attached was a scanned document from Margaret's old safety deposit records. I stared at the date. Then I stared at the signature beneath it. My pulse quickened for the first time in days. Whatever recovery looked like, it was beginning now. Because hidden inside that document was the first piece of evidence that could finally change everything. The following morning, I woke early to the sound of wind brushing against the windows of my Chicago apartment and the faint hum of traffic below. I brewed a pot of coffee and carried it to the small desk where I had spread out Margaret's old records, invoices, and handwritten notes from past projects. For the first time in days, I felt a spark of purpose instead of weight pressing down. Without waiting for anyone to recognize or validate me, I began organizing my work, cataloging the properties I had maintained, the repairs I had funded, and the financial contributions that had gone unnoticed. Edward, Carol's voice came through the speakerphone, cautious but encouraging. These records are remarkable. You should consider sharing them. I nodded, though I knew this was my own journey. I spent hours calling contractors and old clients, not for recognition, but to confirm the details of what I had managed independently. Each conversation reminded me of my skills, my experience, and my value outside the distortions created by family gossip. Mr. Harper, I remember when you rewired the entire electrical system for our rental units, one former associate said. We thought we would need 3 crews, but you handled it yourself. I smiled softly, the words a small but steady balm to the isolation I had felt. By midday, I was drafting a concise record of my projects, timelines, and the investments I had overseen, attaching receipts and photos, carefully preserving the evidence of a lifetime of labor. Outside, the lake sparkled in the spring sun, and for the first time I noticed how the city felt alive, not threatening. My phone rang later in the afternoon. It was a former client, David. Ed, I just saw your summary, he said, impressed. You managed all of this? On your own? Yes, I said, voice calm. I did what needed to be done. He laughed softly. Well, you always were meticulous. As I hung up, I realized I no longer needed to depend on the family's recognition. I had started building a life of my own making, with tangible proof and clear documentation, and each step felt like reclaiming a part of my identity that had been lost in the wedding chaos. That evening, I sat by the window, reviewing the last of the correspondence I had compiled. I made notes for future plans, a personal archive, a small consulting service for property maintenance, and a journal of lessons learned from decades of work. I imagined walking into meetings, not as the overlooked father, but as an expert whose knowledge and foresight could not be ignored. Later, Jake stopped by to drop off a stack of mail. He watched silently as I organized envelopes and spreadsheets, then asked quietly, Dad, do you think people will finally see it? I looked at him and shook my head, smiling faintly. It is not about them, Jake. It is about me. I am seeing it. The satisfaction of taking control, of reasserting my own worth, settled over me like a warm light. Even Lisa called briefly, her voice thin and polite, but I did not rise to her expectations. I listened, acknowledged the message, and continued with my work. By the end of the night, I had mapped out the first steps of a new chapter, one built from experience, resilience, and independence. I knew that what was coming next, the full realization of these efforts and the acknowledgement they would eventually bring, was just over the horizon, and for the first time in weeks, I felt anticipation instead of despair. By the next morning, I had moved into a small office space I had leased overlooking the Chicago skyline, sunlight pouring through the tall windows and reflecting off the glassy surface of Lake Michigan in the distance. I had hung a simple plaque on the door, Edward Harper, consultant, property maintenance and management, and beneath it, a line that read, experienced, reliable, trusted. I adjusted my tie, buttoned my jacket, and glanced at the stack of folders on the desk. Every client I had spoken to over the past weeks had confirmed my expertise, and now, for the first time in years, I felt the weight of authority in my hands. My first appointment was with a contractor who had been skeptical of my capabilities after the wedding debacle. Mr. Harper, he said, adjusting his hard hat, I did not expect you to have such comprehensive records. I see now that you oversaw every step. I nodded, letting the statement sink in. I have always kept detailed notes, I said. It is how I ensure projects are done correctly. He smiled, shaking his head. You have a reputation you earned, and now I understand why. Later that afternoon, a potential client arrived wearing the company jacket of a well-known property management firm. Edward, welcome, she said, handing me a business card. I have heard about your work from multiple sources. Your organization and attention to detail are exactly what we need for our upcoming project." As she spoke, I noticed the way her eyes scanned the office, taking in the neatly arranged files, the charts showing maintenance timelines, and the photographs documenting previous work. I realized that the symbols of professionalism, the plaques, the folders, the carefully prepared evidence, were communicating a story louder than words. Over the next week, my calendar filled with appointments, phone calls, and emails confirming contracts I had quietly negotiated. Each handshake, each signed agreement reinforced a growing confidence within me that had nothing to do with family approval. I watched as clients referred me to others, some even suggesting I expand my services, recognizing a value that had been hidden beneath the misperceptions and gossip of the wedding. During a lunch meeting with Jake, he commented, "Dad, people are noticing you now. You are not just Edward Harper, the father everyone misunderstood. You are respected for what you do." I smiled, stirring my coffee slowly. It feels good, but it is also a reminder. I never needed them to see me to know my own worth. That evening, as I returned to my apartment, I paused at the window overlooking the city lights. The same skyline that had once reminded me of my isolation now seemed to celebrate the steps I had taken. A notification appeared on my phone from Carol. "Edward, the vendor from last year wants to meet. They want your insight on a large project. They have heard about your work." I leaned back in my chair, a sense of calm confidence filling me. For the first time, I realized that my presence, my knowledge, and my integrity were shaping a reputation independent of family perception. And as the streetlights reflected across the lake, I understood that my position of strength, built on decades of experience and quiet perseverance, would soon intersect with the unfolding events of the family. The timeline was returning to the present, and with it, the opportunity to address the truths that had been ignored, with the authority I had finally claimed as my own. The morning air was crisp as I stepped out of my apartment building and walked along Michigan Avenue toward the small hospital conference room where we had agreed to meet. The sky was a pale gray, clouds drifting low over the city skyline, and each step seemed to echo in the quiet streets. I carried a folder of documents, organized, annotated, and verified, evidence that had taken weeks to compile, my only shield and authority in the conversation ahead. I reached the entrance and saw Jake waiting nervously near the elevators, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. "Dad, are you ready for this?" he asked quietly. I nodded, adjusting the collar of my jacket. "We are ready," I said, my voice calm, though my pulse thumped with anticipation. The elevator ride up was slow, and each floor passed like a heartbeat in suspense. When the doors opened, we stepped into a sterile hallway with white walls and the faint scent of antiseptic. The receptionist pointed toward the conference room. "They are expecting you," she said, her tone neutral. I nodded and walked in, noticing the table set with neatly stacked files, a laptop, and 2 chairs opposite mine. Lisa was already there, flanked by a young associate from her office, both reviewing a tablet. She looked up as I entered. "Edward," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "We were beginning to wonder if you would show." I smiled faintly, placing the folder on the table. "I always intended to come," I replied, sitting down. Jake pulled up a chair beside me, fidgeting slightly. "Mom, maybe we should," he began, but I shook my head, signaling him to stay quiet. I opened the folder and began laying out the documents, pointing to invoices, emails, and photographs that meticulously traced months of preparation and contribution. "These records," I said evenly, "show the involvement of every party, including myself. They demonstrate clearly the work completed and decisions made throughout these projects." Lisa glanced at the papers and then at me, her expression unreadable, a flicker of uncertainty passing over her features. "Edward, she began, but I raised a hand slightly, not in anger, but in command of the room. "Please, let us review the facts first. No interruptions. Look carefully at each entry." The young associate leaned forward, scrolling through the tablet, comparing notes. I watched as small cracks appeared in the confident veneer Lisa had projected. The air in the room was taut, each movement and glance deliberate, each pause weighted. "Dad?" Jake whispered. "This is going exactly as you prepared." I nodded subtly, acknowledging both his observation and the magnitude of what was unfolding. Minutes stretched like hours as the documents were examined, the silence broken only by the occasional click of a pen or the shuffle of papers. Lisa's posture stiffened, and she glanced at her associate, a silent communication passing between them, doubt replacing certainty. I felt the shift, the power of preparation, patience, and evidence settling over the room, giving me control without raising my voice. Every glance, every gesture reinforced my presence, and yet I remained composed, letting them digest the full weight of what they had previously dismissed. As I closed the folder and leaned back slightly, I could see in Lisa's eyes that the narrative she had relied upon was beginning to wobble, the first hints of realization flickering. But the moment of truth, the full revelation that would dismantle the assumptions and restore the order, was still to come, poised on the edge of the room like a breath held before release. I watched quietly as Lisa flipped through the documents I had laid out, her eyes scanning each page, lingering over entries she had assumed were insignificant. "Edward," she said finally, her voice measured but tense, I did not realize how much of this you handled personally." I nodded, keeping my expression calm, letting the weight of the evidence speak louder than any words. "Every contractor, every invoice, every schedule, I oversaw," I said evenly. "Not for recognition, but to ensure the work was completed correctly." Jake shifted in his seat beside me, his eyes wide. "Mom," he murmured. I had no idea. I looked at him, and he knew I meant more than the invoices or schedules. "It is not about invoices, Jake. It is about accountability, integrity, and consistency." Lisa looked down at the table, her hands folded tightly in front of her. "All this time, I thought I was controlling everything," she admitted quietly. "And yet you—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. I leaned back slightly, my gaze sweeping the room, taking in the subtle change in posture, the hesitation in her voice, the careful attention of the associate beside her who now looked genuinely impressed. "I acted as I always have," I said. "I take responsibility for my work, for my commitments, and for the people I care about." The room was silent for several moments, only the hum of the air conditioning filling the space. Then Jake spoke, voice low but firm. "Dad," I should have listened. I should have understood sooner. I placed a hand gently on his arm. "You have learned, and that matters more than regret." Lisa finally met my eyes. "I underestimated you," she said, almost as a whisper. "I misjudged your influence, your skill, your foresight." I nodded, acknowledging her words, but not celebrating them. "Recognition is not the goal," I said. "Respect is earned by actions, not declarations. You will see that now, because the facts do not lie." Outside, the light from the window shifted, casting long reflections across the table, as if the room itself acknowledged the shift that had taken place. The associate looked at me with newfound understanding, no longer seeing only a father whose authority had been questioned, but a man whose diligence, patience, and integrity had established him as an expert, a decision-maker, and a figure of quiet command. Lisa's lips pressed together, her hands shaking slightly as she reached for her tablet, realizing that every word she had spoken to others, every exaggeration, every manipulation, was now exposed in contrast to the meticulous record before her. I could see her mind working, calculating, adjusting, while I remained steady, letting her absorb the full impact. Jake swallowed hard. "I cannot believe we didn't see it before." "The truth is sometimes hidden in plain sight," I said softly. "But it is never too late to recognize it." There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, only a profound stillness, punctuated by the understanding that had settled over the table. And in that silence, I realized that this moment, the revelation of what I had truly accomplished, the recalibration of perception and authority, would reverberate far beyond this room. Then, as Lisa's eyes widened in the slow dawning of comprehension, I noticed a small envelope slipped beneath the folder I had brought, the color of cream and sealed carefully, addressed to me. I picked it up and opened it slowly. Inside was a note in Margaret's handwriting, faded but unmistakable, that read, "Edward, what you do quietly carries more power than anything loudly proclaimed." My breath caught. I looked up, and the room seemed to shift with the sudden weight of her words. a shock that left even Lisa momentarily speechless, realizing that there was a history, a depth, and a strategy none of them had fully understood until now. The room remained silent for several seconds after I read Margaret's note. It was not only the words themselves that carried weight. It was where they came from. The envelope had been stored with the original records Carol recovered from Margaret's safety deposit box, the same collection of documents that had remained untouched for years. There was no mystery about its origin, no coincidence, just the voice of a woman who had known me better than anyone else ever had. Lisa looked down at the table. The confidence that had once guided every conversation was gone. In its place sat something unfamiliar, uncertainty. Jake slowly exhaled and rubbed his forehead. "Dad," he said quietly, "I think I finally understand why Mom always trusted your judgment." I folded the note carefully and returned it to the envelope. "Your mother understood something important," I replied. "She knew that character is built over decades. It cannot be created overnight, and it cannot be erased by a few opinions." The associate sitting across from us closed the tablet and leaned back. "Mr. Harper, I have reviewed everything. The records are thorough. The timeline is consistent. There is no confusion here." Lisa closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, they seemed older somehow. "Edward," she said softly, "I owe you an apology." I did not answer immediately, not because I wanted to make her uncomfortable, but because apologies had become complicated things. Sometimes people apologized because they understood the damage. Other times they apologized because the truth had become impossible to ignore. "I appreciate you saying that," I finally replied. "But an apology is a beginning, not an ending." Jake nodded slowly. "What happens now?" he asked. I looked at both of them before answering. "Now we establish boundaries." The words landed gently but firmly. Nobody argued. Nobody interrupted. For a long time, I continued. I allowed other people to define my role in their lives. I accepted assumptions. I overlooked disrespect. I stayed quiet because I believed peace was more important than recognition. That ends today. Lisa lowered her gaze again. "What does that mean?" "It means my work, my finances, my decisions, and my future projects remain my responsibility. I will help when I choose to help. I will participate when I am respected. And I will no longer carry obligations that nobody values." The room fell silent again. There was no anger in my voice. No bitterness. Just clarity. Jake swallowed hard. "That is fair." For the first time in a long while, I believed he truly meant it. As the meeting ended, people gathered their papers slowly. The associate shook my hand before leaving. "Mr. Harper, it has been an honor meeting you." "Thank you," I replied. Lisa remained seated after everyone else stood. Finally, she looked up. I thought I understood what strength looked like. I waited. I was wrong. I gave her a small nod, but offered no lecture. Life would teach the rest. Outside the hospital, Jake walked beside me toward the parking garage. The afternoon sunlight reflected off nearby windows, turning the city into a field of gold and silver. "Dad," he said, stopping beside my truck, "can we start over?" I looked at him for a long moment. The answer should have been simple. Yet relationships are rarely repaired in a single conversation. Trust returns one decision at a time. "We can start moving forward," I said. "That is different." He nodded slowly, understanding exactly what I meant. As I drove home along the lakefront, I felt lighter than I had in months. The truth was finally visible. The boundaries were finally clear. Yet something remained unresolved deep inside me. Because while everyone now understood who I was, there was still one decision waiting for me at home, hidden among Margaret's papers, a decision that would determine not only my future, but the future of the entire family. 6 months later, life looked very different. Not perfect, not dramatic, just honest. The consulting business had grown beyond anything I expected. The small office overlooking Chicago had expanded into a team of trusted professionals who valued experience more than appearances. Several property management companies relied on my recommendations, and for the first time in many years, I felt completely free to choose where my energy went and where it did not. The decision waiting inside Margaret's papers had turned out to be a letter she had written shortly before her passing. Along with it were detailed instructions for a family trust she had quietly helped structure years earlier. The trust was not designed to reward people for titles, opinions, or promises. It was designed to support responsibility, education, and character. After reviewing everything with attorneys and financial advisors, I followed her wishes exactly. Some people received less than they expected. Others received opportunities they never imagined. The difference was not based on favoritism. It was based on accountability. Surprisingly, that decision brought more peace than conflict. Jake began visiting regularly. Not because he needed something. Not because he felt guilty. Simply because he wanted a relationship. Those visits started with awkward conversations over coffee and gradually turned into genuine connection. One Saturday afternoon, we spent 3 hours repairing an old lawn tractor together. At one point, he looked over and laughed. I spent years trying to become successful, and somehow I forgot who taught me how to work. I smiled without looking up from the engine. Life has a way of reminding us. Lisa changed too. Not overnight. Real growth rarely happens that way. But over time, her actions became quieter and more thoughtful. She stopped trying to manage every perception. She started listening more. One evening, she handed me a handwritten note. No explanations. No excuses. Just gratitude. I never mentioned it again, but I kept that note in my desk drawer. Some things do not need to be discussed repeatedly to be meaningful. Looking back now, I realize this story was never really about a wedding, a misunderstanding, or even a family conflict. It was about something much deeper. It was about what happens when we allow other people to define our worth. For too many years, I confused patience with self-abandonment. I thought keeping the peace required shrinking myself. I thought love meant accepting whatever treatment came my way. I was wrong. Real love requires truth. Real peace requires boundaries. And real self-respect begins the moment you stop asking permission to value yourself. If you are listening to my voice right now and carrying a similar burden, perhaps from family, friends, or people you trusted, I want to tell you something I wish someone had told me years ago. Protect your heart, but also protect your finances. Protect your kindness, but also protect your boundaries. Keep records. Pay attention to patterns. Trust actions more than words. And never hand someone the authority to decide your value. That authority belongs to you alone. Through all of this, I also learned to trust something deeper. Some people call it intuition. Others call it faith. For me, it felt like God gently guiding me through moments when I could not see the path ahead. Not by removing every hardship, but by helping me become stronger than the hardship itself. Sometimes the answer is not immediate justice. Sometimes the answer is becoming the person who no longer needs validation from those who misunderstood you. My name is Edward Harper. I am 74 years old. And the core lesson I want to leave with you is this. Never let someone else's opinion become the foundation of your identity. Thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for listening to my story. More importantly, thank you for allowing your own story to continue, even when life becomes difficult. If this journey connected with something in your heart, I would love to hear where you are watching from and what lesson stayed with you the most. And if you believe someone else may need this message today, consider sharing it with them. The truth is that many people are carrying invisible burdens, and sometimes a single story can help them feel less alone. As for me, I still keep one photograph on my desk. It shows Margaret standing beside me in that old garage many years ago, both of us smiling, both covered in dust and sunlight. Every morning when I arrive at the office, I look at that picture before I begin my day. It reminds me that the people who truly know your value never need to announce it to the world. They simply help you remember it when you forget. And perhaps that is the quiet miracle of life. Not that every wound disappears, but that wisdom grows where the wound once lived. If you enjoyed this story, there are many more journeys waiting in this playlist. Some begin with heartbreak, some with betrayal, and some with unexpected second chances. Different families, different lives, different lessons. So take a moment, settle in, and join me for the next story. You never know which one might speak directly to your own heart.